I'm Dr. Cathy Barrera, founding economist of Prysm Group. We're an economic consulting firm for startups and enterprises building platforms using blockchain and distributed ledger technology. Before I hopped on the blockchain train, I got a PhD in economics, in business economics from Harvard, and I was previously faculty at the Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell. But I've since left academia, and I have the privilege this morning of bringing together this group of distinguished academic economists to talk to us today. So why are we kicking off this morning at Consensus talking about economics? Blockchain platforms are economies or markets written in code. The goal of these systems is to use code to bring together a community of folks to coordinate their activities, to transact, to conduct business, to generate value. Blockchain-based platforms are used by individuals or companies to earn income, for example, by engaging in mining, to track and trace digital or physical assets, and to buy and sell goods and services. So, of course, blockchain requires deep expertise in technology, in computer science and distributed networks. But blockchain also requires expertise in economics. The study of how incentives, markets, and other mechanisms help people to coordinate their activities and collectively create value dates back to Adam Smith in the 18th century. But over the last 50 or 60 years, rigorous tools have been developed by academic economists in order to make our understanding of economic mechanisms more precise. And then over the last 30 years, those tools have been utilized by economists not only to study these systems, but also to design them in contexts as far-ranging as spectrum auctions, kidney exchange, and internet marketplaces. So these same tools that have been used in those other contexts can also be used in blockchain, which is what we at Prysm Group help our clients to do. So there's an increasing awareness in the industry that economic design is needed in order to ensure that blockchain platforms succeed and are able to achieve the vision of their ability to create value. And that's why we're here today this morning talking to these fine gentlemen. We have Josh Gans, Eric Maskin, David Yermak, and Oliver Hart. So I wanted to start just by noting that economists have a particular language, particular way of thinking, and that may differ from the way other folks with other expertise or a general audience talks about a technology like blockchain. So for example, you wouldn't normally hear an economist use words like immutability or censorship resistance. So I'd love to start just by trying to bridge that gap a little bit and articulating from an economics perspective some of the benefits of blockchain. So I'd love to start with you, Josh. You have this paper, Some Simple Economics of Blockchain, and in it you outline two potential benefits of blockchain, that it reduces the cost of networking and reduces the cost of verification. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we wrote that paper. So the job description of an economist when confronted with a new exciting technology could be described as desexification. It's basically to take all that everybody else thinks is interesting and reduce it down to a term that economists can use. And when it comes to new technologies, the lens we like to look at is, well, what is this new technology reducing the cost of? I did this trick in artificial intelligence. It was reducing the cost of prediction. And when it came to the blockchain, it was actually quite a hard challenge to think about, we have this new technology. If we try and understand it, where is it going to reduce the cost of doing something in the economy? And so that paper identified two places. One was the cost of verification. And by verification, we mean the ability for people who are not party to a transaction to see what happened in the transaction. And a blockchain, by storing things securely, and securely I mean making it hard to fiddle the books in the future from what you've done in the past, it might actually reduce the cost of verification, and that would enable a whole lot of transactions. The other thing that the blockchain is good for, again on the security front, is it's very hard to develop a new platform or network because you have to think about how to secure it. But the blockchain as an infrastructure, especially things like Ethereum, would allow smaller players to be able to cobble together those secure elements and build applications, and so it may well reduce the cost of networking. And so basically from there, once you say that, everything else is just supply and demand. Well, in this case, it's just a reduction, an expansion in the supply of the activities that rely on verification and networking. And you can then look for places where the blockchain might be useful.
So I think it's, thank you for that explanation. I think it's particularly interesting that you did not mention anything about cryptocurrencies.
Right.
So there's obviously a lot of folks here probably want to hear about cryptocurrencies. There's lots of talk and maybe a little hype around that. So I think maybe we should take a few minutes just to talk about the hype, maybe dispel a few myths. David, you've written a lot about cryptocurrencies, and you have this paper, Is Bitcoin a Real Currency? Can you tell us, is Bitcoin a real currency?
If you go by the criteria economists have used for centuries, which is a currency is a store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account, Bitcoin has never met any of those particularly well. There are not many merchants who accept it. The throughput, in fact, is limited to 7 transactions a second worldwide, so not that many people ever could use it. People don't post prices in Bitcoin, so it's not a unit of account. And as a store of value, it is incredibly volatile. What you want with money is for it to be stable, not only hour to hour, day to day, but even year to year. And Bitcoin has higher volatility than almost any investable asset that you might see. So it really fails all those criteria. But I would say it has done something useful by making us reconsider the definition of money itself. There's a very interesting academic paper written by Professor Kochla-Kota at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. The title is Money is Memory. And this is way before Satoshi. He outlined a vision where people had perfect memory of all transactions, which if you read that paper resembles very closely the blockchain and its implementation by way of Bitcoin. So I think for economists, one of the things we like about cryptocurrency is it pushes you back to first principles. And it makes you reconsider what really is the definition of money. Do we need banks to have banking? And questions like that, which have been really thrown open for reconsideration in an interesting and pretty provocative way.
Eric, I know you might have an opinion about this. Do we need banks to provide this service?
Right, so count me as a crypto skeptic. In addition to the problems that David mentioned with cryptocurrency being a dubious store of value or a dubious medium of exchange, I worry that to the extent that we're replacing public money, government fiat currency with private money, which is effectively what is happening in the crypto world, we may be interfering with important public functions. For example, countercyclical monetary policy. An important role that central banks around the world play is to limit business cycles by varying the money supply according to conditions. If we're all using private money, that's going to be hard to do. Also, the idea that you can go around banks with cryptocurrency, you don't need banks anymore, may sound appealing, but actually, banks perform a useful function too, which is to decide which entrepreneurial projects are promising and which are not. And if we if we undermine the banking system, we're doing so at our peril. So those are a couple of reasons why I'm doubtful.
So it sounds like maybe cryptocurrency isn't the most from an economics perspective, the most promising application of this technology. There are other potential ways that blockchain can provide benefits in markets. And economics is also not entirely about money. We study a lot about how different actors can come together, they can trade, they can generate value, they can cooperate. I thought it would be useful to maybe take a couple minutes just to talk about the way economics views the role of markets and the role of mechanisms. So a thing that sometimes folks I talk to in the industry find surprising is that our economies have a lot of design in them, a lot of in addition to the invisible hand, you sort of have a bit of a visible hand if you know where to look for it. So Eric, your field is mechanism design. And it sort of grew out of this debate about the role of markets versus planning in facilitating sort of efficient outcomes. Sort of where did we end up in that debate, and what have we learned through this field of mechanism design?
Well, you're right. In the 30s and 40s, there was a very serious intellectual debate about whether markets could perhaps be replaced altogether by some sort of planning mechanism. And I think it's fair to say that that in the end, markets were reaffirmed as very often the most powerful and efficient way of allocating goods and resources, but that several conditions had to be met for markets to work well. And one of those conditions is that there has to be sufficient competition. For example, there are very few sellers in a market, they're going to be able to exert monopoly power, and that is going to lead to prices that are too high, quantities and qualities that are too low. So in circumstances like that, where markets don't necessarily work well, we may need to supplement them with mechanism design. And a good example where mechanism design came into play in a big way was about 25 years ago, when many governments around the world realized that it no longer made sense for them to control the radio spectrum, the broadcasting frequencies, because at that point there were a number of telecom companies that had come along who could make better use of this spectrum than the government. And so many governments were interested in making sure that the radio spectrum got put in the hands of the companies that valued the spectrum the most, because it was believed that this would promote the most value for society. Now, if there had been lots and lots of telecom companies, getting the right allocation of spectrum might have been a fairly straightforward matter. The government could have just created a spectrum market and allowed spectrum to be bought and sold like any other good. But because there were so few telecom companies, it was recognized that this could lead to a very inefficient outcome. And so what governments did typically was to create a mechanism for allocating the spectrum, and a very particular sort of mechanism called a second price auction. So the idea is each telecom company would make a bid for a particular band of radio frequencies. The winner would be the high bidder, but instead of paying its own bid, the winner would pay the second highest bid. And the reason for using the second highest bid is that this actually induces each company, each telecom company, to bid exactly what the license is worth to that company, not more, not less. And that ensures that the winner will be the company that really has the highest value. And so variants of this mechanism were used in practice quite successfully, and that ushered in the telecom revolution. So mechanism design here was playing a simple but powerful role in getting the right allocation of resources.
So it sort of coordinated the market in a particular way to ensure that the spectrum went to the company that had the highest value.
That's right. In a world with insufficient competition, there's no guarantee that the right companies would get this spectrum in an ordinary market. So the market was supplemented via the second price auction.
So auctions and these types of market mechanisms are sort of one way where we see that visible hand coming in and helping to facilitate these kinds of markets. But contracts and firms are also important parts of how our economy functions. Now, Oliver, your field is contract theory. Can you tell us a little bit about the perspective of that field around the limits of markets or the roles of these other types of mechanisms?
Yeah, well, Cathy, you mentioned this visible hand and the sort of debate about markets versus planning. At around the same time, in the 30s, you know, when, as Eric mentioned, this debate was happening in the 30s, there was a parallel discussion going on, initiated by Ronald Coase, who made the point that, well, you know, put aside planning, if you look at the economy, we don't just see market, even in a liberal market economy, you know, without central planning, we don't just see markets. We also see a lot of activity taking place inside firms. In fact, it's estimated that these days, about 50% of economic activity takes place inside firms. And Coase made the point that basically within a firm, you're replacing the price system with some sort of authority. And the question he raised is, why is this? If markets are so good, as economists usually argue, why do we have all this activity taking place in sort of mini centrally planned economies? So it's not like the Soviet Union used to be with one huge central planner who's coercive. This was these little islands of central planning which occur within the sort of ocean of the market. And these days, I think the way people understand why we have activity in firms is that using the market is costly. I mean, that's something Ronald Coase himself pointed out. But I think more recent work has gone a bit further. So even when you can't just use the market, another possible way of carrying out a transaction is through a contract. You can have a contract between two independent entities. But one of the problems with writing a contract about in any sort of complicated transaction, and long-term transactions often are quite complicated, and you may be entering into a contractual relationship for many years, and it's very hard to look ahead and think of all of the things that might happen during the course of a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year, 50-year relationship. And it's particularly hard to put all those things, all the things that might happen, into the contract. So real-world contracts are incomplete. They have gaps. They're ambiguous, and there are lots of things in the contract, which are not in the contract, which you'd like to be in the contract, but then as the relationship proceeds, you realize, oh, something's come up that we didn't anticipate. We didn't put it in the contract. The contract doesn't say what should happen. And In this kind of situation of contractual incompleteness, residual control rights matter. That is, who gets to decide on the stuff that is missing from the contract. And this is what governance is all about. Owning things. The owner of an asset has the right to make decisions about how the asset should be used, to the extent that no prior contract says how it's to be used. Votes are important. This is why we see in organizations some people have votes. Shareholders have votes. Owners have votes. And the people with the votes get to decide ultimately how the asset is to be used to the extent that the initial contract was incomplete. And I think that's also relevant for blockchain. So when you think about the protocols of blockchain, who gets to change them? I think it's a mistake to think about all these things as being complete contractual transactions. There's always going to be stuff missing, and you may want to change the rules of the game, and who gets to decide that? So governance of blockchain is important.
Absolutely. I think a variety of sort of really important issues came up, and I think we can try to bring these out and take them to these benefits of blockchain that we discussed before. So, folks are trying to use this technology to create markets where previously there were firms, to enable parties to transact together using automated contracts, using smart contracts to ensure that they get the kinds of behavior they want. And so I think, a question to ask at this point is, how can we use what we've learned from these fields of economics and apply it to this new technology and this new space? How can economic design and blockchain be used together to achieve outcomes that we haven't seen before? I'll open that up to the panel.
So I'm happy to leap in here. So for my sins, I'm involved with an accelerator, the Creative Destruction Lab at the University of Toronto and other places, and it has a blockchain stream. And the idea was, we don't see nearly, for all the length of this technology, we haven't seen much in the way of economically impactful applications beyond cryptocurrency, which everyone can argue about, for the blockchain. And the question was, why not? And the answer that at least we came up with, or at least a thesis, was in order to make value out of the blockchain, you need to have economic innovation. And economic innovation of the sense that Oliver and Eric and co have been doing for years in terms of the design of mechanisms and markets. Now, this is where the cryptocurrency community and the economists come together quite strongly. And Oliver already mentioned it. There is a sense in which there are two ways of dealing with a problem or managing or dealing with an ongoing relationship. You can either design a fancy mechanism so that you can put it in place and everything works smoothly in an engineering sense and you don't have to worry about it again. Or you can accept that you have to manage these things and you're going to have people come and deal with unforeseen contingencies. Now, actually, economists, while acknowledging that there are these two, have a tendency to move towards the mechanistic, just like this community. Near as I can tell, everything that this community has been doing is trying to design automated ways of doing things. One was the example of the smart contract. Actually, the smart contract's a bad name. It really means the not stupid contract. Smart contracts, something smart is not what you want. You want something automated. That's what it means. It means flexibly, beautifully designed at the beginning, so it's so flexibly enough that we can rely on it in an automated sense and not think about it again. So smart is not the word we'd normally use for that sort of thing. But that's where these two things come together. And I guess the message I want to bring is that there is a lot of science sitting within half a decade, or more actually, of economic thinking that has been abjectly theoretical because it has lacked mechanisms for verification, commitment, and also the computing power to put them in place. Eric didn't mention that one of the reasons why auctions took off was simultaneous with our computing power that would allow us to have far more complicated auctions and run them. But they'll only run once. What we're now talking about is running things dynamically in an ongoing relationship. The sort of contracts that Oliver was talking about, the sort of relationships that he's talking about. And so there's a natural bringing together of these two forces. And in our Creative Destruction Lab, we had 25 ventures come in last year, about 10 look like being financially viable. And each one of those, that is other than things of pure cryptocurrency, has come because they've put together a mechanism. One such mechanism is a token reputation registry, a way of crowdsourcing, for instance, in the case of a venture we have called Pocket, crowdsourcing the location of establishments in Africa and generating an actual map of Africa by using people on the ground and providing incentives. That requires a mechanism. It's the sort of thing we don't have time to manage. And that's where you have to look for these things.
You mentioned commitment as an important factor here. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the big problem with having things, so when you write a contract, what's great about it is everybody's obligations are listed. And if you don't perform an obligation, there's a theory that you can go to the court and make sure it gets performed. And because of the threat of that, everybody does what they're supposed to. But the problem is sometimes you have things that happen that are outside the contract that lead to disputes and other things like that. And one way of dealing with disputes is to go to the court. Courts are costly. They require evidence that may not be there. There are ambiguities. And so that, once you have a dispute, it's like you've opened up the whole thing again for renegotiation, redoing the deals. Darth Vader in The Empire Strikes Back. I've changed the deal. Don't make me change it any further. It's something you can do when things are outside of your power. If you could put a contract on the blockchain, you take away the power of any individual to deal with any of these things. Now, it may be, of course, that you still have disputes, so it's not going to be for every contract. But if you can do it cleverly enough, you might be able to provide that commitment in places where at least the court was too costly an option. But now, if it's on the blockchain, it can somehow be automated. It can remove from people's accounts money when things happen. It can have a dispute resolution process and stuff like that.
Oliver, I know that you've studied commitment for a long time, but you've been thinking a bit about how commitment is important for blockchain as well.
Yes. Right. I want to say, I think, to the extent I understand blockchain, which is quite limited at this point, there are some things which seem, very promising. Verification, let me just underline that, as Josh has talked about it. That, I can see, can be very useful. And, some situations where commitment is very valuable, and that can be, and blockchain can help to bring it about. So just to give a couple of examples, and I don't know, how useful these will be in practice, but there are certain situations, for example, where you want to, I want to buy things from perhaps the people in this room. Maybe you're shareholders in a company, and I want to make a tender offer for your shares. And maybe I need 50%, but I actually, for various reasons, I want the deal only to go through if I get 75%. So I make a conditional offer. I'm only going to buy your shares if 3/4 of you agree to sell your shares. Well, in practice, that can be a little difficult to implement because some of you may think, I'm going to go ahead with the deal even if I get less than 3/4. And therefore, you might decide not to sell because you think I'm going to get more than 50%. Maybe I'm not going to get 3/4, but I'll get close enough so that I'll go ahead with the deal. And I may not want that to happen. I may want to commit that I'm only going to go ahead if at least 75% of you sell your shares to me. Well, I can imagine that blockchain could help with the verification process and make that a more credible commitment. So everybody can see, did I get over 3/4? I could have even agreed that if I go ahead with the deal having got less than 3/4, then I have to pay a penalty. So maybe I've done that as part of my deal. I've agreed to somehow, commit not to go ahead with less than 3/4. But, pre-blockchain, it might be hard for people to know whether I got more than 3/4 or I got less. But with blockchain, maybe that's going to be publicly observable. And so the commitment will be possible. So that would be one example. Or another example would be crowdfunding. Maybe I'm going to try to I want to raise money for some project, and I go to people, but I want to tell them, you put up your money, I'm only going to go ahead if I get a certain amount, a critical amount, so you can be sort of confident that if I don't get that critical amount, then I'm going to give you your money back. You won't have to pay anything. How do I commit to that? How do you know whether enough people contributed to the project? I could imagine blockchain could facilitate that and make that verifiable. So those are examples where I think it could be useful.
So public commitment is one potential way that blockchain could be really beneficial. But also, blockchain has this sort of ability to make some kinds of information public and also hide other kinds of information. And this can help with the design of some types of mechanisms.
Right. So I mentioned the second price auction a little while ago in connection with the allocation of radio spectrum. And the second price auction can work very effectively. But if I'm a bidder in the second price auction, I may not want my competitors to know how much I'm bidding, because if they know how much I'm bidding, they know what my value for the spectrum is, and that may hurt me in future interactions that I have with these rivals. So I would like to keep my bids private. But if bids are kept private, how do we know who is actually the winner? And how do we know what the second price is so that the winner can pay that second bid? Well, that's, again, where I think blockchain could be very helpful. We could set up a blockchain mechanism in which people make bids, and people can verify whether or not they are the high bidder or not, and what the second highest bid is, but no further information gets released. So in particular, if I'm the losing bidder, I may not know how much the winning bidder bid. I don't need to know that. So one great advantage I see for the future of blockchain is that it will allow enough information to get out so that we have efficient transactions, but no more than the amount of information that's actually necessary.
I think it's really interesting how the role of information keeps coming up repeatedly in all of these examples. I think that's something that most people don't necessarily know about economics is sort of how important the information is in order to get participants to do what you're hoping they'll do. Come to the auction and actually bid on something or bid truthfully, these sorts of issues. So, economic design is, it's very difficult, right? You can put a mechanism in place and you didn't take the right thing into account and you sort of end up with these unintended consequences. What do you think are the limitations of trying to put together blockchain and economic design? Is this where it's all roses here, or should we be wary about doing this?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of work. Let me do the old Economist adage: if it was easy with the blockchain, we would have seen it already, and we haven't quite seen it already. Apart from the design itself, and let us be very clear, the design of cryptocurrency itself is quite impressive. In fact, the Economist's forecast was that this would be a very stable value at 0. And it turned out that the fact that it's positive at all is somewhat of a miracle. And that's an aspect of design. That mechanism, if you look at Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, I don't know if Satoshi's here today. Can't see her. You know, if you look at the white paper, there's an amazing number of elements. And I was gobsmacked at the sheer number of things that had to come together and now get implemented, and 10 years of proof that it does what it was supposed to do. That's quite extraordinary. However, I think there is more to be done. The one thing we've learned from economic design and market design is it's a bit fiddly. If you miss a key element, the whole market just doesn't work. Things do not take off. It is very hard to herd everybody into the right things. Now, part of that we sometimes analyze and say, well, we got the incentives wrong. There was an unintended consequence, people started abusing the system in some way, etc. The other part is that we don't know in the growth of markets what needs to become a norm. And we have a lot of markets that work that if you were to look at them from an economic point of view, it seems crazy. For instance, I'm not a resident of New York. If I go out to dinner tonight, I can go to a restaurant. They will bring me food. I will eat it before I've paid. Moreover, there's no visible mechanism to stop me from just walking out the door. Any economics textbook will tell you that that was a disaster to set up an entire industry. Yet, worldwide, there it is. Okay? That suggests to you that these markets sometimes co-evolve with norms. And I suspect that's what we may well have to think about very carefully. In the auction design literature, they didn't just say, oh, we're going to auction off spectrum. What they did beforehand was argue about the mechanisms, test them quite a few times, and then run it on the real stuff. And I think we're going to still have to see that sort of experimentation, that sort of minimum viable products occurring in the blockchain space that show that the incentives can work, and that, you know, if there are bad actors, they just don't have enough power to disrupt stuff.
I think what you're talking about here, though, is a new way of keeping records, and probably the most significant change since double-entry bookkeeping came in 700 years ago. And you have a ledger that can be seen simultaneously by multiple people and can't be changed very easily, at least not without everybody seeing the change. And if I know that I'm being tracked in that way, I'm going to behave better. In the supply chain, if I have a delivery truck, the arrival of the truck will have to be reported accurately, and this will maybe trigger penalties, the release of collateral. There's all kinds of ways to squeeze efficiencies out of the system, and it's not so much about the payment of damages, but giving people incentives to behave better in the first place. I know if there's a technology now that tracks my actions better, I'm going to take more care, I'm going to prepare, I'm going to arrive on time. And ultimately, solving these moral hazard problems, which are all over the place in economics, I think is really the promise of this technology. And it's exciting in that sense. There are many problems that were viewed as intractable that are now up for reconsideration. And these spill into areas like the integrity of pharmaceutical trials, where there's a similar issue with the integrity of data, the accuracy of companies' reporting, and so forth. This goes well beyond economics and finance in areas like public health.
Oliver?
Well, I think that we should bear in mind that there are limits to these mechanisms. I think Josh has sort of already talked about the fact, I mean, you can write ever more complicated mechanisms. It's like writing, you know, one approach to dealing with contracts is, yes, let's try to think of as many of the things that can happen during the course of the relationship and put them in. And you get the lawyers together, you know, both sides, and they'll always come up with more and more things that can happen and more clauses that can protect their party against some bad event. And you end up with a contract which is incomprehensible, right? This is what we see. You read any contract between two big firms, you know, in a business-to-business deal, and it's typically incomprehensible. I think there's a better way, which is actually to recognize that there's going to be stuff left out, and instead of trying to put as much in, just instead approach the problem with what's the best way for dealing with the stuff that can be that it will inevitably be left out. And that may involve not having automated mechanisms, but actually building on norms that are out there and the parties can agree to abide by and to follow when they have to deal with things that the contract has left out. So I actually, currently, my view is that we should be thinking more about developing norms and good practices like agreeing to be equitable. This is about business-to-business deals, this is what I'm thinking of. It's a bit removed from blockchain, but I think it provides a good lesson, which is that sometimes the best way forward is not to automate everything, but rather to agree to be nice to each other when stuff happens that hasn't been anticipated.
So I think that the lesson here is that there are many potential benefits of using a technology like blockchain. What we need to do is we need to figure out which are the most promising of those. In which scenarios is this going to be the mechanism that really helps us get to the outcomes that we'd like to see? And in which cases should we be using some other kind of mechanism? And in those cases where we should be using blockchain, how can we design the right mechanisms that will help ensure that participants do what we're hoping they do for this specific type of transaction or value generating behavior? So I think that we've heard from the panelists today a number of ideas about both of those topics, and it's a place to start. We still have a long way to go, but I'd love to thank the panelists so much for giving us your insights today and for participating. Thank you.